Over the course of the hour, we'll give updates on about 25 states that we've identified as states to watch. CSG is, as we like to say here, a region-based national organization serving state governments. So I've divided up the states according to the CSG regions for the purposes of the discussion today. We'll tackle the South first, followed by the East, West, and Midwest. And to help us assess the transportation revenue playing field, I've enlisted a number of great reporters, bloggers, and experts on transportation and state government from around the country to bring us up to speed. Hopefully at the end we'll have some time to discuss some of the major themes we're seeing this year in transportation funding and to take a few of your comments and questions as well. That will be your opportunity to not only seek clarification on anything we've said here today, but also if you feel we gave your state short shrift and can provide an update of your own for us, that would be welcome as well. We ask that you make your comments by typing them into the GoToWebinar interface itself, down there below where you see the questions, on your GoToWebinar interface there. I'll read as many as time allows and direct them to one of our guests. So we're going to start in Virginia, which has been a hot topic of conversation around the country in recent weeks and has really been on the states to watch list for the last several years for a variety of reasons, including a heavy emphasis that they've had on public-private partnerships in recent years. Here's the snapshot on Virginia. Their gas tax is 17.5 cents per gallon, lower than its surrounding states. It was last raised in 1986. The Virginia Department of Transportation says it needs $500 million a year in new revenue by 2019 to stop borrowing new project money to fund maintenance of existing highways. The state has about a quarter of its roads in poor or mediocre condition and its bridges that are structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. Also, 33% of Virginia's major urban highways are congested, which is not news to anybody who's driven around there recently. But so it was with these conditions in mind that Governor Bob McDonnell a few weeks ago stepped forward with a transportation revenue plan that took a number of folks by surprise. And to discuss that, I want to bring in a couple of folks who have both reported recently on what's happening in Virginia. Ryan Holywell is a staff writer for Governing Magazine, and Dan Bach is a staff writer for State Line. Both are based in Washington, D.C. Ryan, we've seen a wide range of adjectives used to describe Governor McDonnell's plan. Bold was the one that was used in the headline of a story that you wrote recently, a quote from somebody commenting on the plan. But critics of the plan have had some other choice words to describe it. What does the governor's plan do, and what's the status of it as of today? I understand it's kind of undergone some tweaking just here in the last couple of days in advance of a looming deadline there.
Yeah, so kind of the latest today, over the last couple of days, it was approved in both the House and Senate state committees in Virginia. Earlier today, it passed in the full House in Virginia, and it's expected to be taken up by the full Senate later today. So it's making very rapid progress. I'll just go through and try to quickly explain what the governor has proposed. And I guess I should preface it by saying, you know, the reason I've described it as bold and other people have described it as bold is simply because of the, you know, how ambitious it is. The governor says this will generate more than $3 billion in new transportation funding over the next 5 years, and also how unusual it is. He's proposed quite a few things that really haven't been done elsewhere. So the most significant part of the plan is that the governor wants to completely eliminate the state's 17.5 cent per gallon gas tax and replace it with an additional 0.8% sales tax. That would, I mean, that'd be unprecedented. There's no other state that's completely eliminated its gas tax. The other thing he wants to do is increase the proportion of the existing sales tax revenue that's dedicated to transportation. He wants to do a $15 increase in vehicle registration fees. He's seeking a $100 new annual fee for alternative fuel vehicles, the idea being that those vehicles sort of don't or historically haven't paid as much gas tax because of their efficiency. And then the last part of the plan, and this one is very speculative because it depends on federal action, but the last component of the plan is that it would take money that could potentially be derived if Congress lets states start taxing internet sales and dedicated some of that funding towards state transportation revenue. So like I said, this would be unprecedented, getting rid of the state gas tax. The idea is that increasing the gas tax on its own doesn't really have legs. As you mentioned, it's been 27, 28 years since the state last did that. So he's sort of betting that it'd be politically more palatable to sort of switch to the sales tax. Also, from a policy perspective, there's a big benefit of that, right, because the sales tax would be indexed to inflation as opposed to the gas tax that becomes less powerful with each passing year.
Yeah. And Dan Bach of State Line, you wrote recently about McDonald's plan in the context of what's going on in other states. You heard Ryan refer to this as unprecedented. But is Virginia part of a larger trend that we're possibly going to see?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as Ryan said, it is unprecedented, and so, going that far may be the unprecedented bit. But it is striking how many other approaches governors and legislators are looking at in order to avoid the gas tax, even places where they're Pennsylvania today we'll talk about a little bit later, but they want to lower the gas tax while they raise another gas tax. So it seems like the gas tax is, it's always been politically unpopular, but it is a last resort. I think it's politically unpopular right now because the gas prices are already high. So the idea that you're paying more on top of your $3, $3.50, $3.75 is it makes it even more unpopular. And it's also, as Ryan mentioned, it just isn't as effective from a policymaker standpoint because they're not selling, they don't get any more money as gas prices increase or as fuel efficiency increases as well. And so, one of the trends I think we will see today is that even when state leaders want more money for transportation, they're exploring all of their options. The gas tax seems like a kind of natural place where you go, and they're not always taking that. It is still in play in a number of states, but it is striking just how many governors and legislators looking for money have ruled out the gas tax.
Yeah. So Dan, is McDonald's plan or something like it? Is it a done deal at this point?
I don't think so. I mean, there's a lot in play right now. The House delegates, as Ryan mentioned, did pass a version of the bill that tracks pretty closely to what the governor asked for. But in the Senate, it's a lot dicier, I think, and we'll have to see what they end up passing. But over there, the Republicans have an idea that would increase wholesale taxes on gasoline instead of going to the sales tax, which is kind of a backdoor way of doing the same gas taxes they would be getting rid of. And that has the support of Bob Cuccinelli, who's the Attorney General, and also the presumptive Republican nominee for governor. So at the same time, you have the Senate Democrats, and they're split 20-20 there, and but they don't like the fact that McDonald's plan is using general funds to pay for transportation, and they would rather it be spent on things like schools. That said, we'll probably find out sooner rather than later. Famous last words, I know, but they are scheduled to be done by February 26th. They have elections looming, so they're going to want to get out of Richmond as fast as they can. As far as bigger significance of this, is that, just for Virginia, it would be huge because this is, transportation funding comes up year after year, and governor after governor comes up with idea after idea, and just really hasn't, nothing seems to have worked so far. They've made improvements, but they haven't gotten all their, so especially for people in Washington, D.C. and Norfolk and places like that, that'd be a big deal. And nationally, as Ryan said, this is unprecedented. So if you have anyone getting rid of the gas tax, and if that is the final component, in the final bill, which it may not be, then you'll see people looking at Virginia to see, whether that was a good idea, how they actually went out and did it. But it is kind of one of those, it would be the exception to the rule, so everybody would probably be looking at it to see whether they want to do it or whether they want to stay away.
And I'll just add, I mean, what's so interesting about what the governor has proposed in Virginia is as he said it, there's something in here that everybody can hate. If you're a conservative, you really don't like the idea of all this new, the increase in the sales tax, Grover Norquist, the no new tax pledge has had a lot of rhetoric criticizing this bill. On the other hand, as Daniel mentioned, if you're a Democrat, you don't like that this puts transportation in competition with education. So I think a lot of people are looking to Virginia to see if the governor has sort of stumbled upon a plan that's absolutely crazy, or maybe it's so crazy that it works, and the jury is still out.
One last just tidbit about that. The plan passed the House today, but it would have failed but for Democrats crossing the aisle. So the Republicans have a big majority there, but it is divisive. It's divisive across region and party and everything else. So I think that underscores exactly what Ryan's talking about.
Yes. All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. We could spend a lot more time on Virginia, and we will return to some of these same themes later, but we want to move on to some other states now. We're going to head further south on I-95 to the Palmetto State. South Carolina's gas tax stands at 16.75 cents per gallon. It was last raised in 1987. South Carolina had a transportation infrastructure task force that issued its final report in December of last year, and they found that the state faces an anticipated $29.3 billion shortfall over the next 20 years just to bring the state's roads to a service level of C. That figure does not include funding for any economic development-related projects. The task force said that due to improved vehicle fuel efficiency and increased fuel costs, gas tax revenues are no longer a growing source of funding. We've heard that before, obviously. So diversified revenue sources are needed there, and you see the numbers there for roads and bridges. I want to bring in another of our guests to talk further about South Carolina. And that man in the hat that you see is Tim Smith. He's a staff writer for the Greenville News and GreenvilleOnline.com. Tim, you wrote recently about how lawmakers and others in South Carolina are keeping a close eye on another state we've already mentioned this afternoon, Virginia. What did you find out, and what kinds of things are under consideration in South Carolina to try to meet those transportation revenue needs we heard about? Tim, are you with us? Tim Smith? Well, let's see. Tim, are you with us? Well, we'll move on and come back to Tim, hopefully. We're going to head out west. Let's go to Texas now. The gas tax in the Lone Star State is 20 cents a gallon. It was last raised in 1991. Under the state's constitution, 5 cents of the gas tax goes to education, while the other 15 goes to the highway fund. The Texas Transportation Institute a few years ago placed the state's highway construction needs through 2030 at a whopping $488 billion, and you see the numbers for roads and bridges. I want to bring in another guest to talk about what might happen in the Lone Star State this year. Tom Benning, there he is a staff writer for the Dallas Morning News. Tom, you've written recently that the Transportation Committee leaders in the legislature appear to have landed on their preferred way to boost the highway fund. What are they looking at, and how do you see their chances of success?
Sure. Well, obviously the transportation needs in Texas are tremendous. The executive director of TxDOT, Phil Wilson, has said that the state needs $1 billion a year, an additional $1 billion a year for maintenance alone, and another $3 billion a year to fund highway projects. So that's spurred a lot of interest among lawmakers, as you can imagine. The two chairmen of the Senate and House Transportation Committees, that's Senator Robert Nichols and Representative Larry Phillips, jointly filed bills last week that would rededicate the 6.25% sales tax levied on new and used vehicle purchases to TxDOT's highway fund. That would eventually, and eventually is the key point, add about $3 billion a year to help pay off some of TxDOT's big debt payments and obviously boost their maintenance budget and help build roads and bridges and all that kind of stuff. The tricky part with this is that it was tried last year by Senator Nichols, who at that point wasn't the chairman of the Transportation Committee. And the issue is that this money, the sales tax, is already dedicated to the general revenue budget. And that brings a whole host of issues with it in that other agencies and departments are getting that money. So to kind of allay those concerns, Nichols has suggested that the money be transferred over to TxDOT 10% at a time. So every year, you know, 10%, 20%, 30% until the whole bucket gets transferred to TxDOT. That way, lawmakers can find some other ways to deal with the general revenue budget. That being said, both Nichols and Phillips have said that they're open to, you know, all ideas about funding transportation. Some other ideas that have come up include tapping the state's rainy day fund to create a transportation infrastructure bank, adding $50 a year to the vehicle registration fee, and ending diversions to other departments, ending diversions from the gas tax. So that's kind of an overview of where things stand. It's too early to know exactly what will be successful, but that appears what the chairman of the transportation committees are seeking.
Yeah. And I was reading today about a hearing, I guess, that took place yesterday, and Texas transportation officials were telling legislators that the state's essentially running out of capacity to issue debt. But some of the legislators were suggesting that TxDOT was not adequately expressing the urgency of the fiscal situation. Do you get the sense that there is a sense of urgency, though, in Austin about finding new transportation revenues this year?
Well, I can tell you that there's certainly been an urgency among planners and transportation minds for several years now about some of the funding shortfall that's coming to fruition. Whether or not they've been effective in relaying those concerns to lawmakers, I can't really speak to that. But there does appear this session to be an intense focus on finding some ways to fund transportation projects. Everyone from the governor to the lieutenant governor to the Speaker of the House, they've all emphasized the need to improve infrastructure, including transportation. And so it appears that I would be surprised if something doesn't happen, but I mean, the struggle here is that, you know, raising the gas tax is seemingly off the table, just because it's it's a Republican-dominated legislature and there's not any interest in raising taxes, and really any interest in raising fees or taxes of any kind. So the favored proposals seem to be shifting money that, in theory, should be TxDOT's to begin with, just based on how the funds are from where they're coming from. You know, a transportation-related tax like the vehicle sales tax, or some of the gas tax money that's being diverted to other departments. That seems to be the favorite idea, because then they don't have the difficult vote of, you know, increasing a fee or raising a tax.
Yeah. Well, Tom, thank you very much. We'll be sure to keep an eye on what's happening down there in Texas, and we're going to move along to some other states now. And let me just check again and see if Tim Smith is back with us. Tim, are you there? All right. Well, we will move along and look at some other southern states to watch in 2013. In brief, here are some more. In Mississippi, the State Department of Transportation is asking lawmakers to increase the state gas tax from 18 cents to 28 cents. That would be the first time the tax has been increased in 25 years and could bring in more than $200 million a year for highway repair and maintenance. In Missouri, the State Highways and Transportation Commission has called for a dedicated 1-cent sales tax that could raise an estimated $7.9 billion over 10 years to help confront infrastructure funding shortfalls. That proposal is actually being introduced today by State Senators Mike Kehoe and Ryan McKenna. A recent report by a Blue Ribbon Citizens Committee concluded the state needs to find an additional $600 million to $1 billion a year for critical transportation needs. Missouri's gas tax, by the way, is 17 cents and hasn't been raised since 1992. One of their pressing concerns is how to fix I-70, a major east-west artery, but raising additional revenues could put Missouri between a rock and a hard place because their neighbor, Kansas, is cutting taxes these days. In North Carolina, the state's new governor, Pat McCrory, is someone who, as mayor of Charlotte, championed transportation's ability to improve the economy, so some have hope he could endorse more sustainable transportation revenue sources and win support from legislators. But North Carolina already has one of the highest gas taxes in the nation. The state has turned to tolling in a significant way in recent years, but has experienced challenges with a couple of toll road projects. North Carolina reportedly faces a $60 billion gap between transportation revenues and expenditures through 2040. Finally, West Virginia, a Blue Ribbon Commission there, which is scheduled to issue its final report in May, will reportedly recommend the state spend an additional $750 million a year on maintenance to preserve existing roads, and an additional $380 million a year on expansion projects, and no word yet on revenue mechanisms they may recommend. And with that, let me just check one more time and see if Tim Smith has joined us. Tim Smith, are you there? All right. Well, we will move along and head east then, and we're going to start in one of my old stomping grounds, Massachusetts. The Bay State has a 21-cent a gallon gas tax, last raised in 1991. The state needs an additional $684 million annually just to operate the existing transportation system, and likely millions more to build new road and transit projects and reduce debt. And the condition of the existing infrastructure is challenging as well from the numbers you see there. To help us examine the dilemma Massachusetts faces and potential solutions, I've enlisted a couple of folks, and actually I believe that Richard Parr is not with us, but Stephanie Pollack is joining us. She is Associate Director of Research at the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern University. Thank you, Stephanie, for joining us, and I wanted to ask what are the revenue options that are on the table that we've heard from Governor Deval Patrick and other players at the State House in Boston?
Well, Governor Patrick had proposed a very substantial 19-cent per gallon increase in the existing 21-cent per gallon gas tax about 3 years ago, and it really went nowhere. In response, the legislature raised the sales tax and dedicated a small piece of it to filling in some transportation gaps. So this time around, the governor has proposed to address the roughly $1 billion a year gap on the transportation budget as part of a larger package of tax increases, decreases, and reforms that would address not only transportation, but a $500 million operating budget deficit and increased investment in education, basically by increasing the income tax, actually decreasing the sales tax over a penny of which currently goes to transportation, and doing some tax reform. So the governor has tied his transportation investment strategy to a much broader set of tax changes that he announced in his recent State of the State address about a week after he proposed a spending plan for about $700 million a year in additional operating funds for transportation and a $13 billion capital program.
Okay, and what do you see as the chances of new transportation funding emerging from the State House this year?
I think, and I do think, by the way, that Rich Parr is on the call, and hopefully he can sort of join us. But I think that the groundwork in Massachusetts has been laid for this transportation conversation for a number of years. We had our own commission that reported back right actually at the beginning of Governor Patrick's first term. That was 6 years ago, and only piecemeal solutions have been put in place since then. We have a much bigger transit issue than I think some of the states we've been talking about on the webinar to date. One of the bigger transportation needs is the MBTA, which is the Greater Boston Transit System, which carries 1.3 million passengers a day, and nearly had to substantially increase fares and cut service last year until the legislature did a one-year bailout with the understanding that they'd come back this year for a more permanent fix. So I think the ground has been laid for at least some increased investment in transportation during the current legislative session. I think the governor took a lot of people by surprise by tying the transportation proposal to a larger revenue and tax reform agenda, and it's not yet clear whether the governor's larger agenda is going to go anywhere or whether the legislature will choose only to address the transportation side.
Yeah. Rich Parr, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can,
Hello?
yes.
Yeah. Oh, hi. Sorry about that. Yes, so, I mean, Stephanie did a great job of summing it all up. I mean, the issue with the T, if you actually break down the numbers on what the governor has proposed, or rather what MassDOT has proposed in their plan, and there is a difference between what MassDOT has proposed and what the governor has put in his budget. A very large portion of it goes to the T, but they've done a very careful job of kind of breaking that up into different tranches because there's a huge political issue in Massachusetts between sort of the Boston area and the rest of the state. There's a lot of resentment stemming from the big dig and the amount of money that was spent on that project. And so there's really been an attempt here to kind of get buy-in from parts of the state that haven't seen a lot of transportation investment in the past couple of decades. Our regional transit authorities in some of our smaller cities, the local cities and towns who have their own roads that they need to take care of. And so the plan has been very kind of carefully crafted to kind of take care of the T's needs, but also to really make a big down payment on kind of the rest of the state. My organization is a business association, and so our perspective on this is we do have kind of a point of view, or we're developing a point of view about the governor's revenue proposal. And I think that the business community is actually coalescing around the idea of a gas tax, at least being preferable to what the governor is proposing. The issue
I think the irony in Massachusetts may be that one of the strategies for getting a gas tax may be to propose an even worse tax.
Yeah, exactly. That might be what's going on here, but I do think the governor is sincere in his desire to really change the tax code to make it more progressive. I think that is an important part of his political agenda. But the business community, this is not our first time on this issue. In 2009, Massachusetts did a major reform to its transportation bureaucracy. We used to have several different agencies. We consolidated them as and at that time, we gave a little bit more money for transportation. The governor at that time proposed a 19-cent increase in the gas tax. It was, and he was actually supported by the business community on that. But it did not go very far on Beacon Hill, and they chose to go another way. And I think since then, the governor has been very gun-shy about the gas tax, and I think that informs part of why he's been going more the general revenue route on this one. But I do get the sense on Beacon Hill that lawmakers are more ready to move on transportation than they are on his larger plan. And so we may see transportation being broken off and treated as a separate matter, possibly, and the gas tax or some other kind of user fees may be a vehicle for accomplishing that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you both so much for joining us and telling us what's going on there in Massachusetts. We want to come back and see if Tim Smith is on the line.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Finally.
Let's go back and talk about South Carolina. Let's see.
Well, I know what the prompt is. In terms of lawmakers looking at the Virginia plan, our legislature is Republican dominated as well, and they've run by rule basically as far as any tax increase has to be revenue neutral. So while they're looking, I think they're very curious about what happens in Virginia. Unless it's revenue neutral, it really doesn't stand a chance of going anywhere in our legislature. So while they do want diversified revenue sources, they very much also want additional revenue. So they're looking at a number of different approaches, and one that is gaining traction right now that's supported by the House Speaker as well as the Senate Majority Leader would be redirecting all the state sales tax revenue on vehicles to DOT, which would total about $100 million a year. The problem with that, as in maybe in other states where this redirecting approach is going on, is that Democrats are arguing that that would simply shift one pot of money to another, and they would still have to address what they're going to do with the agencies that the $100 million is taken from, including education, and presently about $20 million of that $100 million would be spent on education. The Senate's Democratic leader has proposed borrowing the money through a bond issuance for water and road projects. There's also an idea out there from a business coalition that wants a combination plan that would use money, new money coming into the general fund plus the state's capital reserve fund, and then redirecting all vehicle-related fees, which they believe would raise several $100 million. And the governor also has joined in ideas, and she would like to engage in sort of a one-time funding approach in which she would use most of the anticipated surplus this year, which she thinks would be about $77 million plus $10 million from the capital reserve, and then redirecting about $4 million. So those are some of the approaches that are being kicked around right now.
Yeah. And Tim, you also wrote recently that the state might consider dissolving its Transportation Infrastructure Bank and placing its functions inside the state DOT. What's going on there? There are a couple of different causes of that. One is that since the bank was created decades ago, it's probably funded about $4.5 billion worth of projects. And these are for major projects. They have to be $100 million or more and have to be funded. They have to be matched locally. The problem is that because of the dynamics involved, there are only a certain number of areas in the state that have received this money. And that's built up some political resentment and jealousy in some parts of the state that certain parts are being favored and other parts are being overlooked. And in combination with that, last year there was a project that the bank funded, and they came up about $130 million short. This is for an 8-mile stretch of freeway extension in Charleston, and it's a $550 million project overall. So the board voted to essentially fund this with anticipated bond revenue in the future because they're tapped out as far as their bond capacity with this project. And that got some fiscal conservatives upset in the legislature, and the combination of those two things has led to a movement to try and move this bank inside DOT. This is tried, and this was tried in the last legislative session unsuccessfully, but this last year's move for bond anticipation notes may have been the extra impetus that may be needed to actually bring this up for a vote, but we'll see. I don't think anything might happen just simply because the Senate Finance Committee chairman sits on that board, and the House Speaker also is pushing this Charleston project. So those are two pretty powerful forces that would not want to see the board go away. Mm-hmm. Well, Tim Smith from the Greenville News, thanks very much for joining us on the call. And we're going to move back to the eastern states again, and we're going to tackle Maryland next. Another of my old stomping grounds, by the way. They've got a 23.5 cent a gallon gas tax, not raised since 1992. And a Blue Ribbon Commission on Transportation Funding in 2011 recommended that the state raise approximately $870 million in new net annual revenues. You can see where the state is with regards to condition of roads and bridges. And to examine what's going on in Maryland, I want to bring back in our men in Washington, Ryan Hollywell and Dan Bach. Dan, much of the action in Annapolis appears to be coming out of the state Senate, where Senate President Miller has been floating some ideas in recent weeks. What does he come up with?
Well, he's come up with a lot of ideas. So far, he's proposed a 3% sales tax on gasoline, and then he would use all that money for transportation. He also threw out the idea of creating regional entities that could raise local property taxes. There's a couple of light rail projects that they want to see, the Purple Line outside of D.C. and the Red Line in the Baltimore area. On top of that, he has suggested leasing the Intercounty Connector, which is the state's brand new toll road just north of the Washington Beltway. But I guess the other important thing, which I think Ryan's going to pick up on here, is he's been Senate President for 26 years, pretty powerful guy, but he's really been trying to get the governor, Martin O'Malley, to commit to a plan and to try to work with the legislature to sell it.
Yeah. And Ryan, Governor O'Malley, he doesn't appear to be going out on a limb this year as he has in years past in making a proposal of his own. It has, it's his failure last year to get anything done. Is that making him somewhat hesitant to propose something this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the general consensus. I mean, the interesting thing here is that you've got in neighboring states of Virginia and Maryland, and it's sort of the tale of two governors. You've got Governor McDonnell in Virginia, who's sort of taken a national lead on this issue, a big plan, a bold plan, an ambitious plan, and in some ways a risky plan. And over in Annapolis in Maryland, the governor's been strangely silent about all of this. He talked about transportation and infrastructure a little bit in his State of the State speech last month, and he was criticized for not really delving into the finances of the issue at all. I spoke with the lieutenant governor last week, and it sort of the message I seem to get, sort of reading between the lines, is don't expect much to be coming out of them. This is going to be something the legislature is going to have to take the lead on. Last year, the governor proposed a 6% sales tax on gasoline. That's the full amount of the sales tax. What Senate President Miller's proposed is a 3% sales tax on gasoline, so a smaller tax, but perhaps one that's might be a little bit more palatable for those who are leery of increasing revenue.
Yeah. Well, thank you both again, Ryan and Dan, and we're going to travel a little further north and see what's happening in the Keystone State. Pennsylvania has a state gas tax of 31.2 cents per gallon, last raised in 1997. And according to the Pennsylvania Transportation Funding Advisory Commission, which completed its work in 2011, the state faces $3.5 billion in unmet transportation funding needs, and that gap is projected to more than double by 2020 unless the state can come up with a plan. And you see the condition of the infrastructure there. And Dan Bach of State Line is back with us. Dan, we have breaking news sort of as of this afternoon. I guess Governor Tom Corbett has unveiled what can only be described as a long-awaited transportation funding plan during his budget address this afternoon. He actually had an advisory commission that completed its work way back in August of 2011, and he's sort of received some criticism for not endorsing their recommendations right away or announcing his own plan. So now the governor has announced something as of today. What do you know about what he's proposing?
Well, he has made official what people have been speculating about for a number of weeks now. In his budget address, Corbett announced a two-part approach. First, he's going to hike the taxes on the taxes that gas stations pay for fuel. That's the part that pretty much most everybody knew was coming. Right now, how it works is that the wholesalers pay taxes on gas, but only up to the tax is based on the price of gasoline, but only up to the point where gas is $1.25 a gallon, and this would raise that cap. So, you know, the governor pointed out today that, you know, gasoline is 3 times as high as the cap, which existed when they, you know, wrote that law. So he wants to remove that cap, and that's going to be the big revenue generator. I think probably as part of the way to make it more palatable, he also wants to reduce the state's gas tax. You know, that's what you and I would pay, and I think it's from like 12 cents a gallon to 10 cents a gallon. And so, you know, on the one hand, the wholesalers would pay more, and the consumers would pay less, at least in theory. So he's trying to raise about $2 billion for transportation. You guys saw the stats, and they have some of the oldest and I guess most structurally deficient bridges in the country, and so they have a lot of needs there. You kind of rolled this out a while, like I said, for the last couple of weeks, so we've kind of been getting a little bit of input on it already. Just recently, Ed Rendell, Corbett's Democratic predecessor, says he would support the plan, but there are a number of Republicans, and they control the legislature, who are upset with Corbett, another Republican, because he's talking about tax increases. So you know, how far this thing goes, I guess I don't know yet.
Yeah. Well, Dan, thank you again, and we'll be coming back to you. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about Governor Corbett's plan in the days ahead.
Sure.
Staying in the East, for a few brief mentions, there's a bill in the Connecticut House. It's House Bill 5125 to reestablish tolls on Connecticut highways 30 years after they were removed. Governor Daniel Malloy and state DOT officials are said to be interested in tolling as well, and a couple of studies are underway to consider tolls specifically on I-84 and I-95 in the state. In Maine, the legislature and Maine voters recently voted to approve nearly $120 million in bond proposals for infrastructure projects. Governor Paul LePage has said he doesn't intend to borrow anymore until state spending is reduced to his satisfaction. But Democratic Senate President Justin Alfon said the state can't afford to ignore the needed repairs and upgrades to the state's infrastructure. He believes the bonds should not be put on hold while the highways deteriorate. In New Hampshire, the Democratic chairman of the House Public Works and Highways Committee has proposed raising the state gas tax 12 cents over 3 years and increasing vehicle registration fees to raise an additional $100 million annually for the state. The bill could win support since Democrats hold a 221 to 179 majority in the House. New Hampshire hasn't raised its 18-cent gas tax since 1991. In New Jersey, some transit advocates have asked Governor Chris Christie to get behind a gas tax increase to help pay for repairs to the transportation network caused by Hurricane Sandy last year. The state's 14.5 cent a gallon gas tax hasn't been raised since 1988. And across the Hudson in New York, the NYS 2100 Commission recently issued its report on preparing New York State to withstand the next Hurricane Sandy. Among their recommendations was establishing a state infrastructure bank to coordinate, allocate, and maximize investment. And finally, in Vermont, the administration of Governor Peter Shumlin recently proposed a 4% sales tax on gasoline aimed at raising $36.5 million in state funds to avoid losing $40 million in potential federal highway funding this year alone. And with that, we will head west now. And let's start first in Wyoming, where the state gas tax is 14 cents a gallon, has been since 1998. And according to a recent report from the nonprofit transportation organization TRIP, the state needs an additional $110 million a year over the next decade just to maintain the state's surface transportation network in its current condition, and would need an additional $332 million annually to improve the system. The state has 21% of miles on major roads in poor condition and 23% of bridges structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. But those numbers are expected to jump to 34% and 46% respectively in 2023 under current funding levels. Increases in the state gas tax and motor vehicle registration fees are reportedly on the table this year in Wyoming. And here to help us dissect what may happen in Cheyenne is Jeffrey O'Gara. Jeff is an author and television producer for Wyoming PBS. Jeff, you wrote a lengthy piece for WyoFile a few weeks ago in which you sort of did a ride-along with a WYDOT road repair guy and got a first-hand look at the state of Wyoming's roads. And you also took a look at the chances the 2013 legislation will tackle this issue. And what did you find?
Well, first, Sean, can you hear me? Am I coming through?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I guess what I could say initially that I found on that ride-around was that the Wyoming Department of Transportation has a very slick, smart public relations operation. They get you out there and you can see roads that if, for example, you've been out to California and driven around in Northern California as I do and come back to Wyoming, you tend to think we've got great roads here. But you get up close and personal with some of the pavement and you look at some of the problems that we have with the low temperatures and the extremes of weather that we get here, and they make a pretty convincing case that we're falling behind on the roads and something needs to be done. But it's come up before. The Department of Transportation has come in looking for increased fuel taxes without succeeding at it, and what they're doing this time is putting together, I think, a really tremendous operation in terms of different groups that are coming in to lobby for it. To give you the context, Wyoming right now has a 14-cent per gallon gasoline tax. All of our neighboring states are considerably higher. Montana's over 27 cents, Utah's 24 cents, Colorado's 22 cents. So the department and its supporters have basically come into the legislature and said, we need another 10 cents per gallon. Then we won't have to come to you every year begging for the money that we need simply to maintain the current road system. It's being received well this year, and in a moment I'll tell you where it is in the legislature, but it's moving along, and there's a couple of reasons, I think, why it's doing much better this time than in the past. I should probably also give you the context that Wyoming is a fairly rich state, small in terms of population and small in terms of state budgets, but we've got a revenue stream from mineral severance taxes here that just won't quit. So while the rest of the country has been struggling and state governments have been having trouble balancing their budgets, Wyoming's had a pretty good ride here for really over a decade now. And it's been fairly easy for departments like transportation to come to the legislature and say, hey, we need some money out of the general fund. We've got a lot of road building projects we want to do, et cetera, et cetera. That's a little less easy now because things are tightening a bit at the state level in terms of those severance taxes. And we have a fairly conservative legislature in terms of expenditures. We also have a legislature that likes to keep its hand on the throttle. They don't really like dedicating revenues to different agencies that they won't be able to revisit during a budget year every couple of years. But this time around, WYDOT has lined up a tremendous amount of support. There's a group called Save Wyoming's Roads that's sort of leading the charge. And it's got just about everybody in it. It's got the stock growers, it's got lodging and restaurants, it's got the trucking association, it's got the municipalities, which would get a share of this tax. That's one of the reasons. But the real force behind Save Wyoming Roads is the mineral industry, in the guise of what we call the Wyoming Taxpayers Association, which does have a variety of members, but it's primarily funded by the big coal and oil and gas industries that really run the state in the sense of providing almost all the revenue. You could say that Wyoming's been a little bit hooked on severance tax revenue. It pays for just about everything. And so the Taxpayers Association for years has been trying to get some of that over into maybe an income tax or increased sales taxes. We have no income tax, by the way. And in this case, into a fuel tax, which would seem to be a tax on energy, but in fact is viewed a little bit differently. It's seen as a way of shifting a tax to the consumers in the form of people on the highways. So that's kind of where we are. They pushed for this bill, and they really have all their ducks in a row, and they're doing rather well. It's passed the House. It's in the Senate now and will be coming to the floor fairly soon. There have been various amendments we could talk about that have been offered, but so far it looks like an increase of 10 cents in the fuel tax in Wyoming is likely to happen this year.
Great. Well, all right. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us. We're going to see what else is going on out west. And let's take a look at Washington State. Their gas tax is 37.5 cents a gallon on the high side of the states we've talked about today. And they've actually raised their gas tax over the years, most recently in 2008, the last of several increases throughout the last decade. The Connecting Washington Task Force, another of those transportation funding panels we've seen around the country, they identified a constrained funding need of $21 billion for maintenance, operations, preservation, and capital improvement statewide. Transportation officials say while increased revenues have allowed the state to invest in system improvements over the last 10 years, the state has fallen behind in maintaining and preserving the existing transportation system. To help us dissect what might happen in Olympia in 2013, I want to bring in Larry L. Larry, are you on the line with us?
Yes, I am.
Great. Larry is the founder and publisher of the nationally recognized Transportation Issues Daily e-newsletter and blog. He's a former federal relations manager for the Washington State Department of Transportation and a former chief of staff to U.S. Senator Slade Gorton. Larry, you wrote extensively last year, did some great coverage about the governor's race there and about the transportation challenges that the next governor of Washington was going to face. Now, as we know, Governor Chris Gregoire has passed the baton, if you will, to Governor Jay Inslee. And on her way out the door, she presented a plan to create a new fuel tax, but this one is to fund school buses. Tell us about that and sort of what the reaction to it has been.
Well, thanks, Sean. Former Governor Gregoire's transportation funding plan is almost certainly dead on arrival. And certainly dead on arrival if transportation stakeholders have any say in the decision. Gregoire was trying to address actually an education funding issue, not a transportation issue. To make a long story short, the state Supreme Court ruled the state was underfunding education, and so the state is under a court order to increase K-12 education. And subsequently, the legislature must now find about $1 billion additional dollars from a budget that's basically underwater. Gregoire proposed using transportation funds to fund what we would call yellow school bus transportation as one way of resolving education funding issues. She proposed a 5-cent gas tax increase rising to a 12-cent increase by 2017. Of course, if that was enacted, it would be probably decades or longer before the gas tax would be raised for traditional transportation projects, roads and transit and things like that. And the bottom line for this legislative session is it's going to be all about education funding. And the big question is, will there be any room and time to consider a transportation bill, or will it slip into next year's session?
Yeah, and I understand it's sort of a reaction to Governor Gregoire's plan that Representative Judy Cliburn, who's the House Transportation Committee chair and who actually attended one of our CSG Transportation Policy Academies last year, that she has offered a plan of her own to raise gas taxes and fees, but to actually fund transportation. What's the status of that?
That's correct, Sean. Representative Cliburn has a very informal plan that cobbles together pieces of proposals from 6 different stakeholder groups. It calls for a gas tax increase of somewhere between 8 to 10 cents, also raises a number of fees, would probably be a 10-year bill, but that's not entirely clear yet. They're looking under all the cushions, and they may even include, for example, a sales tax on bicycles over $400 or $500, admitting that it doesn't raise much money, but they're trying to spread the pain as much as possible. Clyburn's proposal is very organic and will certainly change many times before it becomes an official proposal. And the House is taking the lead on drafting a proposal this session. The Senate will work off whatever the House proposes. Clyburn has a very difficult job trying to decide how much, if any, revenue should be bonded. Our last two gas tax increases were bonded almost exclusively. That's part of what's caused the hole that the state is in now for maintenance and operations funding. Clyburn also has to decide how much revenue to allocate between the state and cities and counties, which 2 or 3 mega projects get funded and which 2 or 3 don't, how much to allocate to roads and how much to transit and bike ped. We have a very vocal bike ped advocacy groups out in the state, and how much to new roads and how much to maintenance and preservation. The same issues that I think probably most states face. On top of that, any bill with a tax increase requires a 2/3 approval of both legislative chambers. The legislature can pass that as a referendum to the people for their approval or disapproval, or the legislature can pass a bill with 2/3 and enact it, and it would about a 99% certainty be challenged by an initiative. And there are influential legislators on both sides of that, meaning some think they should just pass it with 2/3 and let it be challenged, and others feel very strongly that it should be passed as a referendum.
And do we know where Governor Inslee comes down? Is he going to push for any kind of a transportation plan this year?
We do not know where new Governor Jay Inslee officially stands on a transportation investment proposal. During the campaign last fall, he got boxed into a no tax increase pledge. Later, he made some very general comments, which some folks have interpreted to mean that the governor might view the gas tax differently because it is a user fee. During his inaugural speech, he offered only a very few general comments about transportation, nothing really too substantive. And of course, as a new governor, he's got his hands full with hiring his cabinet and staff, and the education funding issue I mentioned earlier. I think he's going to be in reactive mode on transportation. Certainly, he and his staff that he's hired so far have been having some private conversations with legislative leadership on the new governor's priorities. He's very much a proponent of clean energy and sustainability as it relates to transportation. But I think he's going to be looking to the House and legislative leadership to really take the lead on transportation in this legislative session.
Great. Well, thank you, Larry, and I'm sure you'll keep us up to date on transportation issues daily. We're going to move along and visit Washington's neighbor to the south, Oregon. And in the interest of time, we'll skip over the stats here, because what we really want to talk about in the case of Oregon is the state's efforts to create a new transportation funding mechanism, one based on miles rather than cents per gallon. And I want to bring back into the conversation Ryan Hollywell of Governing Magazine. Ryan, back in December, you wrote an article about the latest vehicle miles traveled pilot project underway in Oregon. How does it differ from what they've experimented with before?
All right. Well, let me just fly through this real quickly. Oregon's an interesting one to watch because, like you said, we're not really talking about sort of big, huge solutions to funding the state's transportation needs right now, but this is sort of a very long-term solution. What Oregon's looking at and what they've gotten a lot of attention for looking at is figuring out a way to switch from the traditional gas tax to a vehicle miles traveled fee. And the way they're doing it right now, they've been sort of examining this issue for 10 years. They are currently finishing up a pilot that's really looking at how to implement this technology. So the idea is to, as vehicles become more efficient and as people drive less, the gas tax sort of becomes less sustainable. So policymakers would prefer to charge drivers based on the number of miles they drive. Right now, they're testing a few pieces of technology in Oregon. One of them is a sort of a GPS meter that's used to detect how far people drive. There's also sort of just a general, almost like an odometer, a miles counter that some people have in their cars. Others are using a phone app to track their mileage, and others aren't using any sort of tracking. They've just agreed to pay sort of a flat fee. And the idea is basically that sort of in many places the sort of start and end of the whole VMT conversation is when you raise the word privacy. When you start talking about issues of privacy, people don't like being tracked. So Oregon is sort of testing out a variety of different technologies to see if they can find a few that people might be comfortable with. What you can expect to see in the Oregon legislature this year is probably legislation that would work to institute a VMT system for consumers who use very efficient vehicles, I believe 55 miles per gallon or higher vehicles, to actually be required to use a VMT as opposed to gas tax. The idea is to sort of require them to pay their fair share. My understanding is that would be the first time in the country consumers are doing a VMT fee, so that's definitely one to keep an eye on. And obviously this is an issue that everyone in the transportation community cares about, both at the state level and the federal level. So I think you're going to see a lot of eyes looking to Oregon and seeing how their VMT experiment is going to pan out.
Absolutely. So thanks very much, Ryan. And we're going to jump quickly now to the Midwest, and you see the stats here on the Hoosier State. In addition to the gas tax, they also have a gasoline sales tax, although currently none of that is dedicated to infrastructure, interestingly. Indiana transportation officials say they need an additional $200 million more per year. Municipalities say they need $800 million more per year to fill the holes in their roads budgets. Indiana is an interesting state because during the years when Mitch Daniels was governor, the state had money as a result of the 2006 Indiana toll road lease. They got a one-time lump sum payment of $3.8 billion and were able to tackle all kinds of projects around the state as part of the Major Moves program. Now that money has run out, and they find themselves at the same cliff where other states find themselves. How do they fund transportation going forward? And I spoke with the chairman of the House Roads and Transportation Committee, Ed Soliday, recently for a forthcoming Capital Ideas magazine piece. And he told me they saw the cliff coming and began hearings 2 years ago to determine next steps. And I want to bring Dan Bach back in. I understand there are a variety of revenue proposals on the table in Indiana, a couple of efforts to recapture some of that gasoline sales tax that I mentioned. They're also looking at how to get owners of alternative fuel vehicles to pay their fair share. And Soliday even wants to do a VMT study there in Indiana. Dan, what are your impressions on the activity out in the Midwest there?
Well, I guess so far, obviously, there's a lot of ideas out there. It seems like that it seems like a pretty high priority, but I don't know that support is solidified around any one of these. Just in the interest of time, I mean, the legislature is looking at a couple different ways. One would devote half of the sales tax on gasoline to transportation, so not going all the way there, as you mentioned, but even half of it would bring in about $286 million a year. And I think another bill would right now, the the gas tax also funds parts of the state police, Department of Revenue, and the Motor Vehicles Division, and so they would eliminate that sort of that diversion of gas tax money so that it would all be dedicated towards transportation. And then their new governor, Mike Pence, was sworn in just recently. he's known, made a name in Congress as conservative, and but also wants to make his mark on transportation funding. So he's talked about tapping the state's surplus fund, which now goes to I think it's local relief and for pensions to build up their pension funding. So there's a lot of ideas out there. It's just really kind of hard to gauge, especially after they did the big the toll road lease. Just all these are kind of out there, and I think they're still trying to figure out which one makes the most sense going forward.
Yep. Okay, Dan, stay right there. We're going to go next to Ohio, and the Ohio Department of Transportation has estimated they face a $1.6 billion shortfall for construction projects already vetted and ready to go to construction, and are short another $10 billion for future projects in the development process. And Dan, we mentioned a moment ago the Indiana toll road lease. Ohio faced a similar option with the Ohio Turnpike, but Governor John Kasich ultimately decided to go a different direction rather than leasing it out to a private company. What did he ultimately decide to do, and what impact is that likely to have as far as transportation funding in Ohio?
Yeah, and I don't know if it was a surprise, but I think a lot of people were anticipating that he might, or at least bracing for the idea that he might also try to lease out the Turnpike. He didn't go that direction. Actually, the financial situation has changed, and part of the calculus, I'm sure, was how much money they would actually get for leasing out the Turnpike. So instead, what they're going to do, or what he wants to do, is raise tolls on the Turnpike every year for the next 10 years. That would be capped at the rate of inflation, because one of the things with toll roads is that people don't raise the tolls for a long time, then all of a sudden there's a jolt. So anyway, so you would take that extra money and then sell bonds, which so you're looking at about $1 billion over the next 10 years. Yesterday, he said he wants to really kind of speed up how fast that those bonds get out the door, and so that he wants to spend half of it by 2015. And the reason that's important is because interest rates are so low and you get more bang for your buck, and then the rest of it would go out the 46 years after that. One of the big sticking points, though, in all this is how much of the new money is spent in northern Ohio. That's where the toll road is, and presumably where most of the drivers paying the tolls, or a good portion of the voters anyway, who live in the area, want to make sure that if they're going to pay higher tolls, that money sticks in that area.
Yep. Great. Well, Dan, thank you again, and we are going to wrap up the Midwest with a few quick notes on a handful of other states. Just to tell folks who may have questions for us, please enter your questions into the GoToWebinar interface, and if we have time, we will ask a couple of them of any of our guests today. And you enter your question down there where you see questions. You can open that up and enter your question, and we'll ask it. So here's some other Midwestern states to watch in 2013. In Iowa, some state legislative leaders are pushing for a gas tax increase as part of a broader effort to reduce other taxes, including commercial property taxes. Governor Terry Branstad has said he would sign a gas tax increase into law, but he's not asking legislators to pass one. But the governor has also said he's focused on reducing taxes and believes anything that's done has to be a net tax reduction. There's also been some discussion about changing the formula that distributes state gas taxes to send a greater share to cities, but the idea is opposed by House leaders there. And Iowa faces a $215 million shortfall in funding to meet current critical needs, according to the State Department of Transportation. In Michigan, Governor Rick Snyder used his State of the State address to call for a $1.2 billion in higher gas taxes and vehicle registration fees to help repair crumbling infrastructure. The governor's plan would be one of two options presented to voters in a May 7th vote if legislation offered by State Senator Roger Kahn is approved. Voters would also be able to consider a 2 percentage point increase in the state's 6% sales tax. Choosing neither, by the way, would not be an option. Khan wants to see the legislature deal with the issue by early March to allow the May 7th vote to take place. Minnesota, the transportation research group TRIP, recently estimated the state needs to invest an additional $171 to $181 million a year. The Minnesota Transportation Finance Advisory Commission, established by Governor Mark Dayton, issued its final recommendations late last year on how to fund and finance the state's transportation system. The revenue options put forward by the panel included increasing motor vehicle registration fees, increasing the per-gallon excise tax rate on motor fuels, increasing the transit-dedicated sales tax in the Twin Cities area, enabling local option sales taxes for transportation, employing value capture concepts around transportation improvements, exploring tolling options targeted for new capacity, exploring public-private partnerships, monetizing existing transportation assets to generate revenue, and continuing the state role in general obligation bonding for transportation projects. The governor said he doesn't support a gas tax increase, by the way. He's expected to call on his new transportation commissioner to sell a transportation funding plan. And finally, Wisconsin, that state's Transportation Finance and Policy Commission, said recently that almost $480 million in additional annual investments are needed across all transportation modes for the next 10 years to maintain the state's infrastructure. The commission explored several alternatives to the current gas tax, including raising the tax by 5 cents per gallon, creating a new mileage-based registration fee for all passenger vehicles, increasing registration fees for heavy trucks, increasing driver's license fees by $20, and getting rid of the sales tax exemption on the trade-in value of vehicles. Governor Scott Walker has ruled out raising the gas tax and creating toll roads in the state. One thing already in the works in Wisconsin is a proposed constitutional amendment that would protect the state transportation fund from transfers. And with that, we are going to open it up to your questions and comments. And if you have one for our guests, please enter it, as I said, into the GoToWebinar interface down there where you see questions. And let's see. We've got a couple of questions folks have asked here so far. First of all, one person asking, where did you get the data on state shortfalls in funding needed for transportation and infrastructure? And it comes from a variety of sources. I haven't found one specific source that has all of them together, but a lot of different news sources. The other question we have here is that most of the answers for revenue shortfall have been tax increases. Has anyone proposed the idea of selling assets? And we talked a little bit about the Indiana toll road lease, the Ohio Turnpike. Those weren't the Indiana toll road wasn't actually selling an asset, but even that sort of leasing an asset seems to have fallen out of favor if the Ohio Turnpike case is any indication, I would think. We want to, while we're waiting for any other additional questions to come in, and we're collating some comments here, let me just pose a question to Ryan Hollywell and Dan Bach there in D.C. As you look around the country at what's happening, do you see any trends emerging, and are there any new ideas under the sun in 2013 with regards to transportation funding? Ryan, what do you think?
I would just say that the trend is, I cover, and Dan also covers, what's happening on the federal side, and over the last few years we've seen that the federal government really hasn't had any more luck solving the transportation funding question than the states when they had the chance to pass the last reauthorization, the last highway bill reauthorization. They did level funding and sort of kicked the can down the road in terms of coming up with the sort of innovative funding solutions that would sort of solve this dilemma of how do you pay for this stuff once and for all. So I think what you're seeing is the state governments and also I might add city governments, local governments realizing that you can't that they're not going to be able to count on the feds to deal with this, and that's why from this presentation you see literally almost half the states taking a serious a serious stab at trying to deal with this because they know rightly that there's not going to be much help for the feds going forward, especially when we're in this time of sequestration and deficit reduction and all of that.
Yeah, last year the talk was about what was going on in Georgia with the local option sales taxes, and obviously those failed in 9 of the 12 districts that they had. Do you think that that's going to be something that we see going forward, sort of that localization and trying to let people know exactly what they're getting for their transportation dollars, or do you think that what happened in Georgia, has sort of made some folks rethink that idea?
Is that for me or for
anybody?
I think that's a possibility. Clearly, that's one of the things that's on the table in Maryland, which, by the way, is also thinking of, well, the Senate president there is thinking of leasing out their new inter-county connector. So I think that that's always the idea that people always say is if you know what you're going to get, then people are more receptive to pay for it. If you looked at Atlanta, and that was the big ask there, that 10-county region. It was, there were a lot of projects, and I think there might have been some confusion about what people were going to get and what they weren't going to get, what was on the list, what wasn't on the list, how the list was made, and those questions, though, it's hard to see how you avoid those. So I mean, I think it's definitely in the list of options. I just don't know that it's going to be successful every time they go out.
Yeah. See, we have another question that's come in. It says, what, if anything, are you hearing from state leaders on the question of mandating advanced technology vehicles and supporting consumers for choosing those vehicles?
If we're referring to fuel-efficient vehicles, the person who's asked the question has sort of tapped into a very interesting debate. What you see Governor McDonnell in Virginia doing, and part of his proposal that was actually shot down by the House today, was the $100 fee for fuel-efficient vehicles. And it sort of gets at sort of two policy goals that can be at odds at times. If we're looking at this from a purely funding standpoint, it makes sense. Fuel-efficient vehicles, they're not paying as much as in gas tax as a traditional vehicle, but they're using the road just as much. Maybe it is fair to ask them to pay a little bit more. On the other hand, if we're looking at it from an environmental standpoint, why would you want to punish someone who's taking a step that's environmentally responsible? So in Virginia, the governor took some heat for that part of the proposal. It was ultimately shot down. In Oregon, you're seeing, their leaders are sort of wrangling with the same question, not wanting to disincentivize people from pursuing those vehicles, from investing in those vehicles, and that's why they've done the VMT, or pursuing the VMT, which they think might be a little bit more equitable and might not be perceived quite as much as a penalty.
You will also see here and there some of the early perks of getting your hybrid, like the, being able to go in the HOV lanes or whatever. I mean, those things are slowly disappearing. So I think as they get more popular, and people are trying to figure out, again, if everybody's driving the hybrid, then what's the point of having a special lane? So.
Well, we are way past our time, and I apologize for keeping everybody so long, but we're going to go ahead and wrap things up for the webinar today. Here's some ways you can get hold of me and find out what we're doing at CSG on the transportation policy front. I can also put you in touch with any of the folks you heard from today. I want to thank all of our guests who joined us this afternoon: Ryan Holywell, Dan Bach, Tim Smith, Tom Benning, Richard Parr, Stephanie Pollack, Jeffrey O'Gara, and Larry L. And look for this webinar to be archived soon on the CSG Knowledge Center in case you missed any of today's event or want to pass it along to a friend. Thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon. By my last count earlier today, we had folks registered from 30 states, so that was pretty good, and a great turnout today. So thanks again for signing up and listening in, and we are adjourned for today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.